Good evening. Go ahead and open up your Bibles to the book of Ruth. We're going to have a reading service this evening, and we're going to go through the entire book in the Old Testament that chronicles this story that bears the name of Ruth, but really it's about several people. And when you take a look at the story of Ruth, and you really consider it for what it is, when it was written, the time period that it's taking place in, it is, simply put, an unconventional story. It is a close-up of raw life in a dark, dark time in Israel's history. And where the conventional method of writing and storytelling of the day would be perhaps to focus on the men and to talk about the great exploits, the things that come about by man's powers, in the first 5 verses of this book, the author, ultimately inspired by God, of course, is going to flip the script and totally shock everyone by killing off all the man characters in the first 5 verses, leaving the women to figure things out. And as we go into this book this evening, if you've studied Ruth at all, you know this, but I need to stress it at the start as we try to put ourselves in the time and place of the story of Ruth. It is hard to overstate how debilitating the social and cultural situation is for these women. They have been left without a voice in the community. They have been left without a means of getting by, so it seems. But the amazing thing about the story of Ruth, like every book in the Bible, is that it is a story about God. And we see through the story of 2 women in particular, and the man that comes along, that God is living and active and involved in our lives. Even in the raw, difficult moments, He's there. And so as we follow Ruth out of the fields of Moab, down the road to Bethlehem, into the fields of barley, to the threshing floor, and ultimately to where the story will end, we too are going to be gleaning. We're going to try to glean what we can from this story and understand the awesome things that God is doing in our lives and what we can be doing to magnify Him. I've asked Dwayne Greenwood to read chapter 1 for us to start us off.
And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab, and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech. I knew I was going to do that, Tyler, and it started right off. And the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. And now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. And then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of their 2 children and her husband. Then she arose and her daughter-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house, and may the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. And may the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." And then she kissed them and lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will surely return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. And if I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters. For it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. Verse 14. And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, and Ruth clung to her. And then she said, Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. And when she saw she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. And so they both went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, Is this Naomi? And she said to them, Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. And I went out in full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth, the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest.
Where is God in tragedy? When the floor falls out from under you. When he feels farthest away, if he's there at all. Where is God? You know, this book starts off simply by saying it was the time of the judges, but that in and of itself tells us a great deal. Israel is trying to make a life for themselves, and while they have the instructions that give life, they are going about it in all the wrong ways. They're falling after idolatry and pursuing gods that are not gods, and God's delivering them over to the hands of their enemies. And there's this cycle that you read about in Judges. And so it's certainly not an ideal time frame. It's a dark period in Israel's history. And so at some point, on top of that, there's a famine. And so this family, the Elimelech family, goes out to Moab, thinking there's food at least there. They're going to leave the promised land and go into a nation of pagans to survive. And then there's death. First Elimelech, and then about 10 years later, his two sons. Important to note, even though his two sons take wives, in the 10 years that it says that they're together, there are no children. And then those two sons die. And so now, all three of these women, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, face dire straits. They face poverty at the best, starvation at the worst. And so in the middle of all of this, just trying to make ends meet, dealing with tragedy and disaster, you wonder, this family is just, where is God? It's fascinating then to see in verse 6 that the Lord visits his people and gives them food. That's what Naomi hears. And so she prepares a return trip, and she's thinking about Orpah and Ruth, and as they're going along, she stops them. And she says, you need to go back. At some point, all of us are going to have to make a choice. More than once, but there are going to be key moments in our lives. The choice between doing what is right and what is easy. And I say that intentionally, what is right and what is easy. Because here, both Orpah and Ruth profess great love for Naomi. They both weep with her. They both say, we're going to go with you. And then Naomi kind of plays out the scenario for them. There is no future for you with me. You can never have another family with me. And she says, God's hand is against me. That's what it feels like. You two go. And so Orpah does what is sensible. It makes sense. She kisses Naomi. With a broken heart, she goes back. But it says here that Ruth clings to her. And Naomi tries to convince her more. No, look, Orpah's making the smart choice, culturally, socially, human-based knowledge. Yes, it's the smart, reasonable, logical choice. But notice the terms that even Naomi in her grief is putting this in. Your sister-in-law has gone back to her land, her people, and her gods. This decision is a lot more than simply staying with this widow or going back home. This has been now put in terms of who am I worshiping? This, Ruth, has been with this family for at least 10 years and has seen how they worshiped, how they talked, the God that they honor and serve. And so something in all of that stirs up in Ruth a heart that clings to Naomi and refuses what is easy and does what in her heart she sees as right to honor her mother-in-law. Some of the most beautiful words in the whole Bible. Instead of going back to these gods of the Moabites, she stays with Naomi, and Ruth says, your people shall be my people in verse 16, and your God is my God. This profession of faith in God Almighty is powerful, and it is going to influence everything that Ruth does through the rest of the book. And so we have to remember this vow she is making here when we consider all the things that she does moving forward. But before we move into chapter 2, I just want you to consider Naomi's perspective on things, because she is really just a female Job in this instance. What hope does she have? She goes back, and some of the ladies that might have even seen her go out with Elimelech say, is this her? She has widow's garbs on. She looks different. Her eyes are red and splotchy. Naomi means pleasant in Hebrew. And so she says, don't call me that. Call me Mara, which means bitter. And again, the perspective that she shares there. The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. It's fascinating that she left Bethlehem in a time of famine, empty bellies, and is coming back at a time where God has given so much in the way of food. They should be full. And yet it's the exact opposite of what Naomi says. I left full. I had my husband and my boys. And now I've come back empty. Don't call me pleasant. This is a woman who feels like God has left her. But yet she's not empty, because Ruth is there next to her. And in that, we see that God is still with her, and he's going to prove it all the more as we move forward. Brandon Fox is going to read chapter 2 for us.
Ruth chapter 2, I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. Follow along as we read. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech. One day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go out to the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. Naomi replied, all right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law Elimelech. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you, he said. The Lord bless you, the harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman, who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to? And the foreman replied, she is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been at hard work ever since, except for a few minutes resting in the shelter. Boaz went over and said to Ruth, listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well. Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. What I have done to deserve such kindness, she asked. I am only a foreigner. Yes, I know, Boaz replied, but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and your mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done." "I hope I continue to please you, sir," she replied. You have comforted me by speaking to me so kindly, even though I am not one of your workers." At mealtime, Boaz called to her, "Come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine." So she sat with the harvesters and Boaz and gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all that she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her gather the grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up and do not give her a hard time." So Ruth gathered the barley all day, and when she beat out the grain at the evening, it filled an entire basket. She carried it back into town and she showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal. "Where did you gather all this grain today?" Naomi asked. "Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who has helped you." So Ruth told the mother-in-law about the man in whose field that she had worked. She said, "The man whose field I worked today is named Boaz." "May the Lord bless him," Naomi told her daughter-in-law. "He is showing us his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband, the man who is one of our closest relatives and one of our family redeemers." Then Ruth said, "What's more, Boaz even told me to come over and stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed." "Good," Naomi explained. "Do as you said, my daughter. Do as he has said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in some other fields, but you'll be safe with him." So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's fields and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued to work with them through the wheat harvest in early summer, and all the while she lived with her mother-in-law.
This is the chapter where, to our own detriment, sometimes we start playing the Disney musical because it becomes a fairy tale. Because our 21st century American culture just sees a romance novel playing out before us. But we totally dilute the story of what God's doing here when we do that. There's not romance here. There's something actually much deeper going on. This is not a dreamy romance encounter between the young Ruth and the older Boaz as they encounter each other in the field, but these are two bold servants of the Almighty God colliding in a moment of great need and in a moment of great abundance, respectively. And what they do challenges and leaves each other awestruck and with a greater faith in God. This chapter begins with Ruth making good on her vow, diligent to provide for her mother-in-law. "Let me go out." You can almost imagine Naomi as she's trying to settle into life now in Bethlehem. I guess we need to eat at some point. I'm not hungry at all, because we know grief does that. But go ahead, my daughter. And so Ruth is industrious and diligent, and she goes, not only putting herself at great personal risk, but putting herself in for a full, hard day's labor of working in the fields under the beating hot sun. And she goes, and she boldly is gleaning among the sheaves. Now, according to the culture and according to God's law, those who were poor and the widows and the orphans, they were to glean from the sides of the fields and the corners. That's what God had instructed his people. You leave the extremities, the boundaries, and the corners for the poor. And so the letter of the law says just the extremities and the corners. And so you can imagine some people in this time, they are trying to get every last bit and maybe quite literally cutting corners as close as they can to get as much crop. We're just after a famine, after all, and we need this crop to bounce back. And so Ruth goes out into the middle of this industrious time, and she is bold enough, and the Bible is just amazing when it talks about God's handiwork in this, because it says she just so happens to find herself in the field of a relative of her father-in-law. And so Boaz comes along and asks about her, not because he's head over heels in love with her, but why? I've heard about you. I heard what you did. I heard that you left your home, your people, your way of life, all because you're so devoted to your mother-in-law. Boaz says, you've come to find refuge under the wings of Yahweh. May he reward you for all this good that you are doing. And so, just as Ruth goes above and beyond to serve Naomi and to boldly go out and to love radically, guess what it inspires this valorous man of God to do? The boundaries and the corners are no longer acceptable in his eyes. The law says that's enough. The Spirit of God's law says take care of people who need it. And so what does Boaz do? Don't go into another field. Every day you come back here. You're safe here. I'm telling my people that you're one of us now. You follow when you see them go out. You can drink from the cistern and the water that my men are pulling. That's more than enough. And Ruth shows it. You have shown me comfort. This grieving, widow, barren woman says, you've comforted me in doing this. Boaz has already gone above and beyond. But yet, as we read into chapter 2, he doesn't stop. It's lunchtime. Ruth, you come over here. Not even one of the servants would necessarily do one of these things. Boaz himself serves her food. Enough so that she has leftovers to take home to Naomi. And then he tells his gleaners, you're going to drop some of this stuff on purpose behind you. It's not just the scraps that we forget that she's going to take home. You're going to give her enough to what ultimately Ruth will take home this first day is 22 liters of barley. That's far above and away beyond what God has ordained in his law, but it is at the heart of what God desires. And from Ruth's perspective, she is encountering Yahweh out in this field at every turn. From the greetings that Boaz and his servants exchange, the Lord bless you, to the way Boaz is treating her, far and away beyond what she would have expected. She takes home this huge ephah of barley, and you can almost imagine Naomi is just shocked, so much so that her spiritual heart starts to flutter, and there's signs of maybe a little bit of life there again. Whose field were you in? And she hears the name Boaz. She says, okay, he's actually one of my husband's relatives. He's a kinsman redeemer, which we'll learn a little bit about in just a moment. But I want you to notice, like Ruth did, that God acts in the commonplace things of life, from the ways that we greet each other, to the kindness we show one another, to simply bringing back home a good day's labor that somebody was kind enough to help provide, and a meal that you don't have to wait to beat out and thresh and cook. There's leftovers for Naomi for dinner. It's in those small commonplace things that God shows Naomi and us, I have not forgotten about you. And as the days and the weeks and the months move on, Naomi slowly starts to come back to life until we find her at the beginning of chapter 3, awakening to ways that she can sacrifice for Ruth. Let's have John Parrish read this chapter for us.
Chapter 3 from the NIV. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you'll be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, Put on perfume and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and he was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet to lay down, and in the middle of the night something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than which you showed earlier. You have not run after the young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another one who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as a guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, "No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl you were wearing and hold it out." When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed a bundle on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz has done for her, and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back home to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled."
Naomi sees all these things that Ruth is doing for her, sacrificing, working, so focused on her. And so Ruth is this huge blessing to her. Now Naomi wants to bless Ruth. If they just kept going on year in, year out, and were able to make a life, survive somehow, Ruth is still left in this position, precarious as it may be. And saying, Naomi starts thinking, there's an opportunity here. But as she starts considering how to better Ruth's life, it is necessarily going to impact her own. Because Ruth has become to her, as we'll see in chapter 4, better than 7 sons. She is doing so much for her aged mother-in-law. And yet now Naomi is at the point where she is ready to put Ruth before herself, to show this kindness that's been shown all throughout this harvest season. Ruth, I have a plan. This is what you need to do. She goes and she obeys. And yet, interestingly enough, Naomi tells her, you just do this, you go down to Boaz, you sit there, and you wait until he tells you what to do. It's going to be apparent what you're proposing, and I use that word intentionally, when you go and he finds you in the middle of the night. But Ruth goes off script. She doesn't wait. Boaz asks her a question. I'm Ruth, she says. Spread your wings, or the corner of your garment, over your servant. That same type of language that Boaz used at the beginning of the season when he said, you've come under Yahweh's wings. And Ruth is now saying, I have come under his wings, and you are the answer to our prayers. for you are a redeemer. There's a word here that gets lost in our English translations, and we have it for the third time here in chapter 3. It's the Hebrew word hesed. If you're taking notes, and it's in chapter 1 and verse 8, chapter 2 and verse 20, and here in chapter 3 and verse 10, where Boaz says, made this last kindness greater than the first. That word kindness there is hesed. And it is a lot more than being nice to someone. It is self-sacrificial service. It's kindness in action. It's something real and tangible that's done because there's a care about the welfare of another person. Ruth is demonstrating hesed when she's willing to send, or Naomi, I should say, is willing to demonstrate hesed when she sends Ruth off to orchestrate this new plan, this opportunity for a new life and a new family. Ruth is demonstrating hesed, not only when she's in the field gleaning, but when she goes off script here and starts talking about the idea of, my mother-in-law has a field that needs to be redeemed. This is a lot more than just Ruth. This is about the family line of Elimelech that's going to be wiped out unless you do something, Boaz. You are a redeemer. And Boaz, as we'll see in just a moment, is also going to demonstrate hesed in what he does and what he's already done to sacrifice for the benefit of Ruth and her mother-in-law. Now, it's important again to realize what's going on here. First of all, we read this chapter with a little bit of tension. There's this sort of espionage spy thriller and maybe a little bit of discomfort for the child of God reading this midnight rendezvous between a man and a woman, but it's precisely in that where you expect something unsavory to take place, that you find two godly people doing what is godly and right, not taking advantage of the situation, but selflessly pouring out for each other. Boaz brings up some news. I am your Goel, your kinsman redeemer, but I'm not the closest. And if we actually look back at the Old Testament laws that are being referred to here, there's actually two at play. One is the idea that when a man dies and has no children, his brother is supposed to come along and marry the widow so that his name can be perpetuated, that his name won't be erased from the records. But Boaz isn't Elimelech's brother. Boaz isn't Mahlon and Chilion's brother. And so he's not technically qualified in this regard to do this. He's not the right guy. But then you have the law of the kinsman redeemer from the idea of the land. In Leviticus 25:25, the idea that if somebody passes away and they have this land, lest that it should be sold off, a kinsman redeemer, somebody's going to come along and buy that land so it stays in the family. And Boaz tells her, look, I know you want me to do that too, but there's actually somebody closer than me. And then he does something truly radical. I'm going to talk to him, and if he refuses, I will do both. I'm not obligated to do this for you. Boaz is right and in the right to simply say, not my concern. God's law doesn't put this burden on me. But that's not the way of Hesed. That's not the way of God's people with love and action. It's not an attitude of that's not my problem. It's an attitude of seeing the love of God in other people and stepping out to risk something yourselves. And while this last chapter might seem fraught with ancient legal terminology and practices, there is radical love on display. Brian Weaver is going to read it for us.
Chapter 4. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. And then he said to the closest relative, "Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell a piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here, and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you. And he said, I will redeem it. And then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. The closest relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and the exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So the closest relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, and he removed his sandal. And then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today. All the people who were in the court and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord take the woman who is coming into your home, like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord, who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The neighbor women gave him the name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron was born Ram, and to Ram Amminadab, and to Amminadab was born Nahshon, and to Nahshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz, and Boaz Obed, and Obed was born Jesse, and to Jesse David.
The legal proceedings here are lost on us. I almost wore sandals just so I could slip one off and kind of make the point that this is very much anchored in a time and culture that is lost on us. But nonetheless, there's something, as I said, radical happening when Boaz sits at the city gate with this other kinsman redeemer, whose name we don't know, and these 10 elders of the city who are witnessing and basically giving testament to what's being done here. But this, I want you to notice, is again selfless sacrifice. Why doesn't this no-named redeemer ultimately take up the opportunity he has? Boaz says, this is this parcel of land, and he's, this guy has a lot to gain. Oh, I'll buy this piece of land. We're in a good time. We're bouncing back from a famine. I can have even more inheritance for my family. There's this more land that I can acquire under my name. And then Boaz says, the day that you acquire it, you will also acquire Ruth, to perpetuate the family name of Elimelech. Now his tune changes. Why? Because he's not obligated to do this, but he now realizes it's going to cost him something. My inheritance, the translation that Brian was reading from, says, I will jeopardize my own inheritance. The English Standard in verse 6 says, I will impair my own inheritance. It's going to cost me something if I take this woman to be my wife and then I have a child by her and it's actually under Elimelech's name. Well, then this property that I thought I was getting, I'll actually go now to this family. That's a risk I'm not willing to take. And just like Orpah, He doesn't have to. And so he doesn't. And again, I cannot stress this enough. Boaz doesn't have to. But he does. You know what we learn from inference here? This is going to cost Boaz something. And yet he willingly does it. I've acquired this field. I've acquired Ruth to be my wife. And the elders bless him. They bless him with these names that were of great renown in Israel. Perez, Tamar, Judah, Rachel, and Leah. They're attributing Ruth qualities and characteristics of some of the remarkable women in their nation's history. As they've said in this book, she is a worthy woman. I love the story of Ruth in that it models for us not just doing what is the expected minimum as God's people, but boldly living like the Lord, going above and beyond to bless, to serve, and to sacrifice for somebody else's welfare. And God is going to use what is common and even marginalized, like a barren, widowed foreigner, to stir hearts and to push his people to realize his glorious purposes. This book, depending on your knowledge of the Bible, kind of ends on this flat note where it's just a bunch of names. But the fact of the matter is, one of the great kings of Israel, the great king of Israel, from a human standpoint, King David is going to come from this line because this family line was saved. And as New Testament Christians, you and I know that that generation and that genealogy continues. In fact, this is recorded a little bit more thoroughly in the Gospels. Because from Boaz and Ruth, father to be born. God's fingerprints are everywhere in this story. And I love it. Because it's not in a prophet coming and proclaiming some great message. It's not in some miraculous, huge feat that's done and makes everybody cry out. It's in a heap of barley dropped on the floor when you weren't expecting it. It's about putting yourself at great risk, at the mercy of somebody else who could totally throw you out in the cold. And he says, "The Lord bless you." It's in these choices you and I make every single day to practice hesed, to be God's people, and to let God work through us to bless others, to show others his ways, his truth, and his love. Ruth is a story of everyday life. God does not speak through these amazing, miraculous signs and wonders, but there are people and circumstances that show that God is moving and active. I love here that the end of the story is not with a baby on Ruth's lap. Did you notice that? We come back to the central character not being Ruth, but ultimately Naomi. It's Elimelech, her deceased husband's line, that's being carried on. A son has been born to who? Naomi. This woman who thought the Almighty is against me, his hand is against me, now realizes that she holds this boy in her hands. God is good. God is good. When it's hard for me and I'm going through dark times, God is still good. And when he doesn't feel close, he's still there. And so tonight, if you're reading the story of Ruth and you feel like you are in a dark place where God is far off, let this account in the Old Testament remind you that he is not far away, that his hesed is still toward you, that he wants to show kindness and goodness to you. And for the child of God, there's a challenge here. Where can you and I be like Ruth and like Boaz? To go beyond and above what's expected or the bare minimum requirements, to truly shine God's love boldly. There's lots of opportunities if we will just take them. And the story of Ruth is certainly fascinating because it shows us that God knows, God cares, just like with Naomi and Ruth, he has not left you or I without a redeemer. I appreciate Matt leading the songs tonight about the concept of redemption, and that's a theme in the book of Ruth we see a lot from a familial and a land perspective. But I cannot help reading in chapter 4 in verse 14, when the women of the city, who didn't recognize Naomi when she came in at first, now they say this: "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." You could say those words that they're saying about Boaz from a spiritual sense about Jesus Christ, and they are just as true. Blessed be the Lord who has not left you and who has not left me without a redeemer. We, by our sins, have cut ourselves off from the family of God, and we, like Naomi and Ruth, have no hope. We face spiritual poverty and certain spiritual death. And God doesn't have to do anything about that because we've earned it. And yet God comes along and he buys us back. That's what redemption means. Buying something back, regaining something in its full value. So as Boaz redeems the property of Elimelech and he redeems Ruth, by extension Naomi, Jesus Christ, through his death on the cross, buys back those who would unite themselves to him. We're going to sing this song about redemption. I know that my Redeemer lives. And there is great hope and confidence in this song if we understand what we are singing about. But if you have not tasted this sweet redemption of being freed from your sins and the mistakes that have separated you from God, this is what it's about. This is what life is about. If you need prayers, if you need encouragement, if you need to obey the gospel, to allow Jesus Christ to redeem your life from darkness, from hopelessness, into life eternal with him, don't just sit there. I beg of you, please, step forward, talk to us afterward, ask your questions, whatever it might be. Let us know how we can help